there, Buttercups. Your resident Teabelle here. Welcome to Hark, 'tis the Teabelle. Let's dive in for that tea today, huh? Before kings and queens wore crowns, before saints walked hillsides, before Ireland was Ireland, there were gods, there were warriors, and the veil between worlds was paper thin. Buttercups, this week we walk into legend, into the fairy mounds and sacred wells, onto the battlefield soaked in prophecy, into reigns where goddesses reign supreme, into halls where warriors boasted by torchlight, into legends where heroes burn so brightly they cannot live long. This is Celtic mythology. Long before written language dominated Ireland, meaning was carried through symbols, carved in stone, woven into jewelry, hidden in sacred landscapes. To the ancient Celts, symbols weren't decoration, they were maps of the universe. So let's explore some of those more powerful ones, okay? Now, we talked about the Shamrock a little bit in last week's episode, and it's actually one of the most recognizable signs of Ireland. But its sacred meaning existed long before Christianity arrived. Okay? So it held the power of three. So for St. Patrick, it held the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. While the Celts believed that the three was a sacred number representing balance and harmony. Common Celtic trinities included earth, sea, and sky, or you could see it as birth, life, and death. So the symbol has already resonated deeply with Irish spiritual tradition. So when St. Patrick actually arrived and used it, it worked perfectly. And truthfully, that tells us that sometimes the best religious marketing is simply good symbolism. Isn't it? The number three is going to be very important throughout all of Irish folklore, mythology, everything. And one of the oldest symbols in Ireland is the triple spiral of existence, okay? It appears carved in the ancient monument of Newgrange, a Neolithic passage tomb older than even the pyramids of Egypt. So this triple spiral represents motion, cycles, and the eternal movement of life. Interpretations can include life, death, and rebirth, land, sea, and sky, and also past, present, and future. The spiral itself symbolizes growth and evolution. It's always moving outward. Nothing stays still, just like life. One thing we're going to learn is that in every Irish folklore, mythology, legend, the earth itself is alive. And across Ireland's landscape stands mysterious megalithic stones. Many date back from about 4,000 to 5,000 years. Ancient people believed that these stones marked places where the veil between worlds was thin. And they served as ceremonial gathering sites, burial markers, spiritual portals. And the stone circles aligned with celestial events, solstices, and equinoxes, showing early Irish cultures had deep astronomical knowledge. Places like Newgrange are aligned so that sunlight floods the chamber during winter solstice. Imagine the moment ancient people saw the sun reach deep in the darkness of the tomb. This wasn't just architecture for them. This was a cosmic story that they were seeing. Fire held deep spiritual significance in the Celtic belief. It symbolized purification, protection, transformation. During seasonal festivals like Samhain, sacred fires were lit across Ireland. Villagers extinguished their hearth fires and relit them from a central ceremonial flame. This represented a spiritual reset, a renewal of life for the coming season. Fire was also linked to the goddess Brigid, associated with poetry, healing, smithcraft. Even today, a sacred flame burns in her honor in Ireland. Even today, many Irish people avoid disturbing certain lone hawthorn trees. Why is that? Because they are believed to be fairy trees, entrances to the realm of the Fae. These trees often stand alone in fields or near ancient ring forts. Farmers historically refused to cut them down, even if it meant changing road construction or farming patterns. In fact, modern roads have been rerouted around fairy trees due to cultural respect and maybe a little superstition, because when it comes to the Fae, it's better safe than cursed. We're going to be going a little bit more into detail for the Fae shortly into the episode, okay? The intricate Celtic knot is famous for its never ending loops. This means that there's no beginning, there's no end, just continuous interwoven paths, right? The knot symbolizes eternal love, interconnected life, eternity. These designs become especially popular in early medieval manuscripts like the Book of Kells, a masterpiece of Irish monastic art. Every twist and line reflects the Celtic worldview, which is that everything is connected. We've talked about a lot of Greek symbols, but why do they matter so much, right? So, for ancient Ireland, symbols were more than just art, they were spiritual technology. They encoded ideas about balances, cycles, transformation, the unseen world. And many of these symbols still surround us today. Every shamrock, every spiral, every knot. They all whisper a much older story. Everything moves in cycles. Nothing truly ends. Irish folklore, Irish mythology, it isn't just cute fairy tales. It's layered, it's eerie, it's ancient, and it's still quietly believed in parts of rural Ireland today. Ireland doesn't just tell stories, it lives them. Now, before the cathedrals, before castles, before St. Patrick ever set foot on Irish soil, Ireland belonged to the Celts. They arrived around 500 BCE and they brought with them language, art, warrior culture, and a spiritual worldview that saw the earth as alive. And to the Celt, the land wasn't property, it was divine. Rivers had spirits, trees held wisdom, whales were portals, mountains were sacred beings. Oak trees, in particular, were revered. The very word druid may derive from a word meaning oak knower. Stone circles and burial mounds weren't just artificial feats, they were spiritual centers aligned with the sun and stars. Sacred sites like the Newgrange, which was older than the pyramids themselves, aligned with the winter solstice sunrise. The Hiratara, where it sat the high kings of Ireland. These weren't ruins, these were power points. And druids held enormous power. They weren't just priests, they were judges, advisors to kings, astronomers, healers, historians. They memorized thousands of oral law and poetry. Writing was discouraged, knowledge was sacred and living. To train as a druid could take up to 20 years. Now imagine carrying an entire culture in your mind. How awesome is that? But how amazing is that, right? And the Celtic Ireland was tribal. It was divided into clans and kingdoms. Honor was everything. Warriors trained fiercely, not just in combat, but in storytelling and poetry, because reputation outlived the body. Heroic tales weren't just entertainment, they were moral blueprints. Bravery, loyal sacrifice, to die in battle was not tragic, it was eternal glory. And the Celts also believed that the soul was immortal, which is why storytelling was sacred, because death was not an ending, it was a transition. Some Roman writers even claimed Celtic warriors fought fearlessly because they believed they would return in another life. Bravery in life shaped the afterlife. Imagine living without fear. That is power. Now, Celtic art is also instantly recognizable due to its endless knots, spirals, and interwoven patterns. We talked about how the Celtic knot basically let us know that things didn't end. They were continuous, and everything was intertwined. These designs weren't random. They symbolized eternity, the interconnectedness of life. Later, when Christianity arrived, these patterns fused into illuminated manuscripts like the breathtaking Book of Kells. where pagan artistry and Christian devotion actually merged beautifully. Ireland did not erase its past, it simply braided it in. Okay? And when Christianity came to Ireland, it didn't fully extinguish the Celtic belief, it actually just absorbed it. Sacred wells became holy wells, goddesses into saints, seasonal festivals became feast days. So you can see that the ancient pulse never fully disappeared. It's in the music, the poetry, the fierce independence, the deep respect for storytelling. Even today, Ireland feels much older than its timeline because it carries all the memory in its soil. Before there was luck of the Irish, there was resilience and rituals and reverence. A person who believed the land was alive. They faced winter without fear. They saw death not as darkness but as a doorway. That is ancient power, and it still hums beneath the shamrocks. We kind of discussed Samhain just a little bit as the precursor of Halloween, right? It wasn't about candy, it was about survival. And for ancient Irish communities, this wasn't just a seasonal change, it was a sacred threshold between worlds, where many historians considered it to be the Celtic New Year. Agrarian societies structured their lives around farming and livestock. So by Samhain, the final crops were harvested, the livestock were brought down from summer pastures, winter preparations were beginning. Because survival during winter was uncertain, Samhain symbolized the end of one life cycle and the beginning of another. In this sense, the festival was deeply spiritual. It reflected the Celtic belief in life, death, and rebirth as an ongoing cycle. And it allowed one of the most famous beliefs associated that the boundary between the human world and the otherworld became thin. Now, the otherworld in Irish mythology is the realm of the fair folk or fae, spirits of the dead, super beings and gods. Supernatural beings and gods, let me rephrase. So during Samhain, people believed these beings could cross into the human world more easily. And because of this, people practiced rituals meant to honor their ancestors, seek guidance from spirits, and protect themselves from harmful supernatural forces. Some families would even leave food offerings for visiting spirits or deceased relatives outside their home. Which I wouldn't mind a cookie or two. Just saying. Bonfires were one of the most important Samhain traditions, and across Ireland, communities gathered on hilltops to light large ceremonial fires. These fires served symbolic purposes. It was protection against evil spirits, purification before entering winter, and a symbol of the returning sun and life. People would often extinguish their fires in their houses and relight them from the communal sacred flame. This symbolized unity and renewal for the upcoming year. Some accounts even suggested that the ashes from the fire were spread across the fields to protect crops and livestock, which makes sense if they have such a hearty belief in it, right? Now, during Samhain, people sometimes wore masks or disguises. Why was this? They wanted to blend in with wandering spirits. They called this tradition guising, involving people going house to house in costume and reciting songs or poems in exchange for food. Sound familiar? This practice is considered an only early ancestor of modern trick-or-treating. Another tradition was carving lanterns from turnips or root vegetables to ward off spirits, the early version of jack-o'-lanterns. Now, with all this going on, the veil between worlds was believed to be thin. So it was also considered the best time for divination. Now, people tried to glimpse the future through rituals involving apples, hazelnuts, fire, stones placed around bonfires. Some rituals were meant to predict marriage, death, or luck in the coming year. These practices survive today in traditions like bobbing for apples. Now, when we go to Samhain in Irish mythology, many famous Irish myths take place during Samhain. So ancient texts describe it as a time when battles began, kings held gatherings, magical events occurred. And why? Because the veil was very thin between the two worlds. In early Irish literature, great festivals and assemblies lasting several days were held during Samhain, where people feasted, held contests, and discussed laws and politics. In mythological stories, it was also when portals to the other world opened and supernatural beings emerged. Now, when did we transition from Samhain to Halloween? When Christianity spread through Ireland and Britain, church leaders placed All Saints' Day on November 1st. The night before became All Hallows' Eve, eventually shortened to Halloween. So a lot of the modern Halloween traditions that we participate in actually comes from Samhain customs. The carving of the lanterns, wearing costumes, going door to door for treats, bonfires, and autumn feasts. Now, we know that Halloween is a big thing for a lot of people. Why does Samhain still matter today? Because it's still celebrated by modern pagans, druids, and spiritual practitioners as a time to honor our ancestors, reflect on mortality and transformation, to release the past and welcome renewal. In many ways, Samhain reminds us of something ancient cultures understood well. Okay? They remind us that life moves in cycles. Light returns after darkness, and every ending holds the seed of a beginning. Now, before humans ruled Ireland, there were the divine. The Irish believed in the Ishi, supernatural beings who lived in ancient mounds and ring forts. Many farmers still avoid disturbing fairy forts out of respect or fear. Better be safe than sorry. And they are believed to be descendants of the ancient supernatural race known as Tuatha De Danann. And they were the supernatural race that were descended from the skies and dark clouds. So these fairies of Ireland are not Disney fairies. Let's just make that clear now. They were masters of magic, skilled warriors, poets, healers, shapeshifters. When they arrived in Ireland, they burned their ships. This was a symbol that they were not going back. They possessed 4 sacred treasures: the Stone of Destiny, which roared when the true king stood upon it, the Spear of Lu, the Sword of Nuada, the Cauldron of Dagda, which no one ever left hungry from. When humans arrived in Ireland and defeated them, they retreated into burial mounds and hills, becoming the fairy folk. Important, you never say fairy in certain parts of Ireland. You call them the good people. Because they can bless you or they can ruin you. They can steal your livestock or swap your baby for a changeling. Yes, you heard right. Changelings were deeply feared. Fairy children left in place of human babies. People avoided disturbing fairy forts or ring forts even into the 20th century. They'll reroute a whole road for this. Roads will be rerouted probably until the end of time for this. And this is how real that belief is. They didn't disappear. They became the Fae. Now, we talked a little bit on leprechauns, tricksters of Irish folklore. Mischievous cobblers with pots of gold, yes, but originally they were solitary fairies known for trickery and guarding treasure. Now, they are one of the most recognizable figures in Irish folklore, but their original legends are far stranger and more complex than that cheerful cartoons we see now. So, a leprechaun is a small supernatural being in Irish folklore, usually described as a tiny old man with a beard, a hat, and leather apron who works with a shoemaker. He is typically solitary and known for guarding hidden treasures. Now, unlike many other Irish fairies who live in communities, the leprechaun is considered a solitary fairy, meaning he lives alone and rarely interacts with others except to play tricks on humans. Now, he is most often associated with hidden treasure, pots of gold, shoemaking and cobbling, mischief, and trickery. Now, each version, early versions, let's be honest, of this creature appear in medieval Irish literature, particularly the story of Edstra Fergusa MacLeddy, or The Adventure of Fergus, son of Letty, from around the 8th century. In this tale, small water spirits attempt to drag a sleeping king into the sea. When captured, they grant him wishes in exchange for their freedom. Over time, these small spirits evolve into the mischievous fairy figure now known as a leprechaun. Some scholars also connect them to the Fae, supernatural beings believed to be descended from the Irish gods known as the Tuatha De Danann. Now, why are they shoemakers? And that's one of the most curious details in leprechaun lore. In traditional folklore, leprechauns are cobblers, shoemakers who repair shoes for other fairies. The sound of their tiny hammers striking leather is said to reveal where one might be hiding. The connection may come from the Irish phrase leth brogan, meaning shoemaker. The constant shoe repair supposedly comes from the fairies dancing all night long, which would make sense if they're actively trickery, being, in their mind fun. Now, the idea that leprechauns guard pots of gold at the end of a rainbow developed in later folklore and storytelling traditions. And that means, according to legend, leprechauns hide their treasure from humans. If someone captures one and keeps their eyes on him, the leprechaun may reveal where the gold is hidden. But the moment the person looks away, even for a second, the leprechaun vanishes. The trickster behavior is a central part of their myth. Listen to many stories, greed never ends well. And I'm going to relate this to one of the things that we see is Lucky Charms. They're always trying to chase that leprechaun and his charms. And today we imagine leprechauns like our Lucky Charms character, right? But earlier folklore, oh no, they described them quite differently. They were often mischievous pranksters, cunning and untrustworthy, occasionally mean-spirited. So they were mean, untrustworthy sometimes, pranksters. And some stories say they caused household problems such as spoiling milk, stealing food, or leading travelers astray, which makes a lot of sense. Only in the 19th century did writers and storytellers begin portraying them as humorous and playful characters, rather than darker supernatural beings. By the 20th century, the leprechaun had become a global symbol of Irish culture. So where do you see him today? St. Patrick's Day decorations, Lucky Charms cereal mascot, ... Boston Celtics, or Celtics in this case, logo, and Irish tourism marketing. But these modern images are far more cheerful than the mysterious tricksters of Irish folklore. And they often wore red, not green, early leprechauns, they did. Most stories describe them as male and solitary. They are usually about 2 to 3 feet, and catching one, you might get 3 wishes, but they're always going to try and trick you. Here's the thing that I find interesting, if I'm very honest, and I'm wondering if anybody else is noticing as well. What we learned about leprechauns was essentially that they have a darker past than what we are used to seeing, right? Doesn't Disney do that? Or a lot of things? Is that just what we do, is we adapt it to make it seem a little less scary? I guess that's a question to ponder. Now, one of the most taunting and fascinating figures in Irish folklore is the banshee. In Irish folklore, few creatures are as chilling or misunderstood as this. Her name comes from the Irish phrase banshee, meaning woman of the fairy mound or woman of the other world. In Irish belief, the world of spirits, the realm of the Fae, exists just beyond our own, and sometimes that veil gets thin. When it does, the banshee may appear. Now, what does she do? Her role is simple, but terrifying. She doesn't cause death. This wailing woman foretells death. Her eerie, mournful cry, called a keening, is said to echo through the night when someone in the family is about to die. Now imagine you hear a piercing wail rising from the fog just outside of your home in the stillness of the night, midnight. That sound meant someone in that household would soon pass away. Not exactly the lullaby anybody wants to hear, right, when they go to bed. That wail may actually have roots in a real historical practice, though. In ancient Ireland, women known as keeners performed ritual mourning at funerals. They would sing sorrowful laments, cry loudly and rhythmically, and chant the deeds of the deceased. And over time, folklore transformed this tradition into the supernatural banshee, a ghostly eternal mourner. Now, is she evil? Here's the twist. She is not. She doesn't kill, she doesn't curse, she simply warns. In many traditions, she's seen actually as a guardian spirit of a family, grieving for them before the tragedy arrives, mourning before it happens. She is less monster and more messenger of fate. Still terrifying, though. Let's not forget that. Now, according to tradition, certain ancient families had a banshee attached to their lineages, right? So, some of the most famous include the O'Brien clan, the O'Neill clan, the O'Connor clan, the O'Grady clan. Legend says that these families were so ancient and noble that the spirit would assign them a supernatural mourner. The banshee mourned before death even occurred. So, we know what she does and why she does it, but what does she look like? Now, Irish legends describe the banshee in several different forms, and that's even more mysterious, right? So she can look like an old woman. Sometimes she can appear with as a wrinkled crone, wearing gray or white robes with red eyes from endless weeping. And she may sit beside a river or wash blood-stained clothing, a haunting image connected to death omens. But she could also come as a beautiful woman, stunning with long flowing silver or red hair, singing a sorrowful song. The beauty is deceptive, though, because her song signals tragedy still. Now, there's also some legends where she resembles a washer at the ford, the phantom washer. She might be kneeling beside a stream, washing the blood-stained clothes of someone about to die. Spotting her was said to mean that person would pass soon. And so she could be seen as a pale matron, as well. So she has several different forms. And the question is now, where would one encounter such a figure, right? And in Irish folklore, it goes back about 1,000 years. Some accounts describe wailing heard across hillsides, screams outside rural cottages, apparitions near rivers or crossroads. But even in modern Ireland, some people claim to have heard the sound. And once you hear it, you never forget it. And knowing how much this goes back and how old this really is, what does this mean? Why does it fascinate us so? Well, because the banshee represents something really deeply human. Grief, loss, the inevitability of death. She also symbolizes something very comforting, though, that someone, somewhere, mourns before we are even gone. Someone will miss us. So if you ever find yourself wandering the misty Irish countryside at night, and you hear a long, chilling cry outside carried on the wind, you might not be alone, because somewhere beyond the veil, the banshee could be watching. Her cry isn't a threat, it's a warning, and in Irish culture, death has always been approached with ceremony, song, and story. The Otherworld. The Irish believed in a parallel realm of beauty, youth, and danger. It wasn't heaven, it wasn't hell, it was Tirnog, the land of eternal youth, a place where endless beauty reigned, music and feasting abounded. There was no aging, there was no sorrow. Time worked differently here. Okay? A single night in Tirnog could be hundreds of years in Ireland. Okay? Single night. The hero most famously associated with this realm is Oisin, who fell in love with the fairy woman Nema and traveled to the Otherworld. When he returned, centuries, 3 to be exact, had passed, and everyone he knew was gone. When he touched the ground, he instantly aged into dust. Irish folklore loves that ache. Beauty mixed with loss, a bittersweet ending, if you will. Now we meet the legendary Puka, one of the most unpredictable spirits in Irish folklore. The Puka is one of the most mischievous and fascinating creatures in all of it, okay? It isn't purely good, it isn't evil. Instead, it lives in the in between, mischievous, mysterious, and deeply tied to the natural world. Its name comes from the Irish word puka, meaning spirit or goblin. So, one of the most unsettling things about the puka is that it can change form. So, it could appear as a wild black horse with glowing eyes, a goat with twisted horns, a massive hare, a dark dog, or even a strange human like figure. The most famous form is the black horse, often galloping across hills at night. And here's where things get creepy. If a traveler accepts a ride from the horse, the puka may take them on a terrifying ride across cliffs, rivers, and forests before throwing them off somewhere far from home. Sometimes it leaves the riders unharmed, sometimes not. Now, if you're wondering if the puka is associated with Samhain, you are correct. It is. The ancient Celtic festival marking the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter, because it was believed to roam the countryside on Samhain night. It would spoil crops. It could spoil crops, or it could bless them. Farmers even had a tradition tied to this creature. They would leave the last crops in the field untouched. These were called the puka's share. It was believed that if the spirit received its portion, it might bless the harvest instead of ruining it. Although unlike many mythical beasts, the puka is said to speak human language. Now that's a little more terrifying, and let's be fair, okay? Because out of all the other ones, this one can communicate with us. Just a thought. And it enjoys conversation, especially confusing or frightening followers, travelers, if you will. Stories say the puka sometimes gives cryptic warnings, plays elaborate tricks, offers strange prophecies. But you really can't be sure whether it's messing with you or helping you, which is classic trickster energy, right? Now, not all puka encounters are bad, though. In some legends, it helped farmers with harvests, it protected livestock, it warned travelers of danger. However, other times it scared villagers, created chaos, and led travelers astray in the dark. It's basically the wild spirit of the Irish landscape itself, unpredictable and untamed. Now, the puka appears in folklore across Ireland, but some places are especially tied to it. Now, one famous location is Puck Fair in County Kerry. This festival celebrates a wild goat crowned as King Puck. Okay, and some scholars believe this tradition is linked to ancient puka myths. For 3 days each August, the town celebrates with music, parades, and folklore. And the puka has influenced many stories and pop culture depictions of trickster spirits. So you can see it in Celtic fantasy novels, folklore-inspired films, the play Harvey, where the invisible rabbit friend is described as a puka. So it's one of the most recognizable creatures in folklore even to this day. Now, why are we still fascinated? Well, because it represents something ancient, something wild, something that refuses to be controlled. And it reminds us that nature and the supernatural world isn't always predictable. Sometimes magic is playful, sometimes it's dangerous. And sometimes it just wants to take you for a ride. The puka represents chaos, but not always cruelty. And Irish folklore often lets you live in that gray area because it does. Ireland's mysterious sea folk, the Selkies and the Marrows. They carry some of the most haunting and emotional stories in Irish and Celtic folklore. The Irish coastline is wild and unpredictable. Think crashing waves, mist rolling over cliffs, and seals bobbing in cold Atlantic waters. Ireland's coastline is wrapped in sea stories. So it's no surprise that Irish folklore imagined something magical living just beneath the surface. Two of the most fascinating creatures are Selkies and Marrows, sea beings tied to longing, love, and the pull of the ocean. But while they both come from the sea, they are both very different creatures. Let's talk about the Selkies first, the seal people who shed their skins to walk on land. In the water, they appear as ordinary seals, but on land, they remove their skin, their seal skin, and become a human. Their transformation is the heart of many Selkie stories. Now, the classic Selkie story is based on when a human steals a Selkie skin, the Selkie is bound to them. Now, many legends follow a haunting pattern. A fisherman will discover Selkies dancing on a moonlight beach. One removes her sealskin to become human. That fisherman will steal the sealskin, and honestly, without it, the Selkie cannot return to the sea. Unfortunately, that means that the Selkie is forced to marry that human and live on land. Now, there are times where these two people will have a child or children, but years later, she will find that hidden sealskin. What happens when she touches it? She runs back to the ocean, and that means she's leaving everything behind, even her children, because the sea always calls her home. These stories often symbolize the longing for freedom, the pull of nature, and the idea that love cannot last. Selkies are often portrayed as tragic figures, beings caught between two worlds. Alright, so let's go ahead and meet Ireland's version of the mermaid, the Merrow. Now, the name comes from the Irish word meaning sea maiden. Unlike Selkies, the Merrows are true sea beings. They don't shapeshift. They're not seals either. They're often described as green-haired, fish-tailed from the waist down, webbed fingers, and having shimmering scales. But their most important feature is a magical cap called the Cohuleen Druith. This is an enchanted red cap, allowing them to travel between sea and land. If someone were to steal this cap, the Merrow would become trapped on land, and this is a theme very similar to the Selkie stories, right? In coastal Irish communities, Merrows were sometimes believed to warn fishermen of the storms. How? If someone heard a strange wailing or, say, a song rising from the sea, it could mean that a storm was coming. And this is where some fishermen refused to sail if they thought they heard this. And now, their cry could sometimes be compared to the banshee, but instead of predicting death, the Merrow's voice actually just warned of danger at sea. And here's the thing. There is a dark side to everything, and the dark side of the Merrows is that they weren't always beautiful. Now, females were often described as enchanting, whereas the males, not so much. So they described the males as grotesque, sharp-toothed, and guardians of underwater realms. Some stories even say that the males kept the souls of drowned soldiers in cages beneath the sea. Yeah, Irish folklore can get that dark, and are we surprised, really? Just saying. Everything has a dark side to it. So, though people sometimes mix them up, the Selkies and the Merrows, the differences between them are very important, okay? So let's remember that the Selkies are seal shapeshifters. They become human by removing their seal skin, and they often experience tragic love stories. Where the Merrows are true sea beings, they have fish tails, and that's them. They're true sea beings. They use magical caps to travel between worlds, and they are often connected to storms and sea magic. Both of them provide something for Ireland's deep relationship with the ocean, okay? That's where they probably emerged from. So for centuries, fishing communities lived with the reality that the sea gives, the sea takes, and the sea never truly belongs to humans. Now, Selkie and Merrow legends helped explain the mystery of the water, and the strange sense that something intelligent might be watching from the waves. If you ever visit the rugged coast of Ireland, and you see seals watching from the water, or maybe you hear a strange song carrying across the waves, just remember, you might not be alone. Irish folklore rarely lets love win without sacrifice. Enter Cú Chulainn, a demigod hero of the Ulster cycle, one of Ireland's greatest mythic heroes. If Ireland had a mythic superhero, it would be him. And as a boy, his name was Satanta. He killed a fierce guard dog in defense and offered to take its place as a replacement until one could be raised, right? And he did this all as a child, which is crazy to me. And this is how he earned his name, though, the Hound of Kalan. But if you thought that was wild, it gets more wild. He was said to enter a battle frenzy called warp spasm, where his body would twist into a monstrous form. His body twisted, one eye would bulge outward, his hair would stand on end like spears, blood shot from his head, blood heated his skin to steaming. He became unstoppable. He defended Ulster single-handedly against invading armies during the epic cattle raid known as the Tyne Bo Colonich. One boy against entire armies. Sorry, y'all. But like many Celtic heroes, his life was short. Prophecy followed him from birth, and glory demanded sacrifice. But, like many Irish heroes, his story will end in tragedy. Even in death, such, what do you want to call it? Such heroicism in this. He tied himself to a stone so he would die standing. This was so that he could face his enemies in death, standing. This is iconic behavior. We can see that Irish mythology doesn't worship perfection. It reveres courage. That's Celtic heroism. Brilliant, fierce, and tragic. Ireland's Dark Queen, the Morrigan. She's not quite a hero. She's not a villain, really. She's a shape-shifting goddess of war and fate, and one of the most complex figures in Irish mythology. She is a war goddess, or a goddess of battle, if you will, a shapeshifter who chooses to appear as a crow and a raven more so than the others. She's a prophet of doom, or maybe you could call her the harbinger of death, perhaps. A symbol of sovereignty, a weaver of fate. She both aids and opposes Cuchulainn, who we just talked about, the Hound of Ulster, right? She loves him and had offered her help, but he refused her, and she later appears at his death. She foretells death, yes, but she also determines kingship. And she represents something far more important. She represents the terrifying truth that fate can't be outrun. She embodies the terrifying power of destiny. She's not evil. She's inevitable. In Celtic myth, fate isn't gentle. It is a watcher. It observes. The Morrigan reminds us that the divine feminine is not gentle. And let's just go ahead and say that she is actually part of a terrifying divine trio, a group of war goddesses tied to fate, death, and prophecy. Alright, so we're going to talk about Bov, the Crow of Battle. Alright, she is one of the most chilling and mysterious figures in Irish mythology. And her name actually roughly translates to crow or battle crow. But she's not just a bird circling the battlefield. She's war itself. Now, she is a member of the terrifying divine trio of war goddesses tied to fate, death, and prophecy. We did talk about one already, the Morrigan. And now there are a couple other members that we will probably talk about. Macha, who was the goddess of sovereignty of war, and another who sometimes appeared in the group, Navan, spreading madness and panic during battle. Now, altogether, they represent the chaos, the prophecy, the inevitableness of war. Alright, but Bov most famously appears as a raven or crow circling above warriors. In ancient Ireland, seeing crows gather after a battle wasn't unusual. They fed on the fallen. But mythology turned this grim sight into something more natural. So when Bov appeared, battle was coming, death was sure to follow, and fate had already been decided. She sometimes perched on the shoulder or armor of warriors destined to die. Talk about a terrifying omen. Please don't sit on my shoulder. But she didn't just observe battles, she foretold them. She would appear before a conflict to deliver cryptic prophecies about who would live and who would fall. Sometimes she spoke in riddles, sometimes she simply screamed. Her terrifying cry was known as a battle shriek, a supernatural wail that struck fear into soldiers' hearts. Imagine hearing a raven scream across the misty battlefield at dawn. Not exactly comforting. And she plays a major role in the legendary Second Battle of Mag Tuired, where the gods of Ireland battled monstrous enemies called the Fomorians. Alright, the Tuatha De Danann actually ultimately win. After the battle, Bav flies across Ireland proclaiming victory, shouting prophecies about the future of land. But her words are unsettling. She predicts strange seasons, social chaos, conflict among people, and we have to remember that victory in Irish mythology rarely comes without warning. One of the most fascinating things about Bob is that she's not really considered evil, though. Instead, she represents something deeper. The fact that conflict will happen, the power of prophecy, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. In Celtic belief, death in battle wasn't always tragic. It could be honorable and heroic. And Bob's presence reminds warriors that their fate is already written. She's just revealing it, really. And why is it the crow? Well, the crows and ravens have long been connected to intelligence, mystery, death, and prophecy. Across many cultures, they are seen as messengers between worlds. In Ireland, the crow became the perfect symbol for a goddess who watched over the thin line between life and death. And based on what we just learned, that makes sense, right? Now, in modern culture, she still appears in modern fantasy, literature, and neo-Celtic spirituality. She is often portrayed as a dark crow spirit, a battlefield goddess, maybe sometimes a guide between life and death. Her myth reminds us that Irish mythology isn't clean or comforting. It's wild, it's haunting, it's beautifully complex. Next time you hear a crow calling in the distance, just remember, in the old stories of Ireland, that wasn't just a bird. It might have been Bov, watching, waiting, and whispering the fate of warriors. Let's go ahead and talk about the third main player in that trio of scary goddesses of war, okay? Macha. She is a powerful and mysterious goddess tied to war, sovereignty, land, fertility, and fate. She's going to be connected with royal power, horses and speed, war and battle, and the sacred land of Ireland. But her most famous legend is really, sadly, a story of cruelty, humiliation that leads to a curse that haunts an entire kingdom. But let's get into it. So, one of the most famous myths about her is that she appears in the Ulster cycle, set in the ancient capital of Ulster. A man secretly marries a mysterious and beautiful woman, Macha herself in human form. And she lives with him peacefully, and he asks only one thing. She's asking him to not boast about her to others. That seems simple, right? Something really, really simple. But she married a man, so of course, it's not going to happen. But during a feast hosted by the King of Ulster, this man she married is bragging that his wife can run faster than the horses of the king. Of course, the king is going to be insulted and he's going to demand proof. So the messengers drag Macha before the court. There's just one problem. She's heavily pregnant, which leads to the race that should have never happened. So she's begging them, please let me give birth first. I think that's fair. But they refuse. They're men, in this case, and their egos are hurt. And they force her to race the king's horses anyways. Now, despite the pain, despite the cruelty, she runs. And she wins. Go, Macha, right? But the minute that she crosses that finish line, she's collapsed, and now she gives birth to twins. Now, she's angry, she's in pain, and she rises and curses the men of Ulster. Okay? Now, this is where we lead to the curse of Matcha. With her final strength, she declares a terrifying curse. Whenever the men of Ulster face their greatest battles, they will be stuck with the same birth pain she felt as she was giving birth to her children. The curse lasts 5 days and 4 nights. Now, this curse takes effect during the famous battle Tain Bo Culinich, leaving the kingdom defenseless. Only one only one warrior remains able to fight, Cuchulainn. But why could he fight? Because he wasn't born when the curse was cast. One goddess, one act of cruelty, and it brings an entire kingdom to its knees. Now, she is strongly associated with horses and speed. In fact, the name Iman Macha, the ancient capital Ulster, means the twins of Macha. Today, the site is known as Navan Fort, one of Ireland's most important and archaeological sites. Scholars believe that Macha may originally have been a sovereignty of goddess, symbolizing the sacred bond between king and the land. In Celtic belief, the land was feminine. The king ruled only with the land's blessing, and Macha represented that divine authority. Now, beyond that famous curse, Macha also appeared in myths as a battlefield spirit, a protector of territory, a fierce supernatural presence. And that's not surprising. In some stories, she rides across battlefields or appears before great conflicts. Like the other two, Bob and the Morrigan, she reminds warriors that fate can't be escaped. And Macha's myth carries a very powerful message. She's not simply a war goddess. She represents justice against cruelty, the strength of women, the sacred power of land and sovereignty. Her curse is not revenge for pride. It is a punishment for arrogance and injustice. In Irish mythology, even kings can be brought down when they disrespect the sacred. Next time you hear the thunder of hooves in an Irish legend, remember the woman who outran the king's horses, gave birth on a battlefield, and cursed a kingdom. That was Macha. In Irish mythology, the Fomorians, which we talked about, were terrifying supernatural beings connected to chaos, darkness, the sea, and destruction. They appear throughout early Irish mythological texts as ancient enemies of the gods and early settlers of Ireland. And they do have their stories preserved in medieval manuscripts, such as the Book of the Taking of Ireland. These Fomorians represent the wild, untamed forces of nature, storms, drought, and death, and often opposing the divine tribe known as the Tuatha De Danann. Right? How did they look? Well, they were described as monstrous giants or demonic beings. Their appearance varied widely in different legends, but common descriptions include one-eyed, one-armed, one-legged, goat-headed or animal-like sea-dwelling giants. Now, these strange physical traits symbolize distorted or destructive natural forces. Some scholars believe their name may mean undersea dwellers or demons beneath the sea, which makes sense based just on looks alone. The Fomorians were frequently associated with storms, rough oceans, darkness, and death and destruction. They were sometimes described as raiders arriving from the sea attacking the early people of Ireland. In mythological symbolism, they represent the dangers of nature that early society struggled against. Now, what are some Fomorian figures that were important? Well, Balor, the evil eye. He is the most famous. He is most terrifying, and that feature that makes him terrifying is a gigantic, destructive eye that could kill armies with one glance. Y'all, I said it, one glance. Legend says he had His eye had to be lifted open by servants because it was so heavy. But when it opened, it unleashed death and devastation. Baylor ruled the Fomorians with brutal tyranny. But, I mean, is that all at all surprising? Alatha, the beautiful king. Now, unlike many Fomorians, Alatha was described as strikingly beautiful and noble. He became the father of Breeze, who later ruled the Tuatha De Danann for a time. This connection shows that the mythological tribes were not always purely enemies, their bloodlines sometimes mixed. Now, that son, Briss, was half Fomorian and half Tuatha De Danann, and he became the king of the Tuatha De Danann, but he ruled poorly. He ruled very poorly. He demanded heavy tribute. He forced the gods into labor. He showed little generosity. Because generosity was sacred in Celtic culture, he was eventually overthrown, which makes a lot of sense. Now, remember we talked about that great battle of Mag Turid, which was the greatest conflict between the Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann, right? Now, during that battle, which symbolized the clash between order and chaos, Baylor kills many warriors with his deadly eye. But he's actually ultimately defeated by his grandson, Lugh. Lugh fires a sling stone into Baylor's eye, killing him and turning the eye's destructive power back upon the Fomorian army. This victory marks the triumph of light, skill, and civilization over destructive chaos. Now, what do the Fomorians symbolize? Well, this is a mythological representation of dangerous sea raiders, natural disasters, dark powers of the world, enemies of civilization. They embody the primordial chaos that existed before order came to Ireland. And in mythological cycles, especially the Irish ones, they tell a tale of Ireland's earliest supernatural peoples, right? And they also appear as oppressors from demanding tribute from the early settlers of Ireland. Essentially, they were the bad guys in any form or fashion that they wanted that you could see. So we're going to bring a little bit of light into this now and talk about Bridget. She is a flame of creativity. She is light, she is warmth, she is inspiration. She is the goddess of poetry, of healing, and of smithcraft. Associated with fire and the hearth, that means like she's a protector of the home and inspiration. Her festival on February 1st marks the first stirrings of spring. She bridges mortal and divine. Creativity and sustenance are sacred acts. Now, deep in the earliest layers of Irish mythology lies a powerful and mysterious goddess known as Danu. She is often called the Mother of Gods, the divine matriarch from whom the magical race known as Tuatha De Danann take their name. In fact, their name literally means the people of the goddess Danu. This makes her one of the most important yet most mysterious figures in Celtic mythology. She represents something ancient and elemental. She is believed to embody flowing rivers, fertility in the earth, abundance and nourishment, creation itself. Unlike many mythological figures, Danu doesn't appear frequently in stories. Instead, she exists behind the stories, like the soil beneath the forest. She is the origin, the life-giving force from which gods, heroes, and magic emerge. Many scholars believe Danu was originally a river goddess. Across the ancient world, rivers were seen as life-giving mothers. Without them, civilizations would never have survived. Interestingly, rivers across Europe may share her name. The Danube River, Don River, Dnieper River. These rivers may derive from an ancient Indo-European root word meaning flowing water or river mother. This suggests that Danu may have once been a part of a much older, widespread mother goddess tradition. Now, the divine race of the Tuatha De Danann is said to be her descendants. They were powerful beings who ruled Ireland before humans. Now, among them were the legendary gods and heroes like Lu, master of all skills, Nuada, the silver-handed king, Brigid, the Dagda, the good god with the endless cauldron. These divine figures shaped the magical age of Ireland, and all of them trace their lineage back to Danu, the original mother. In many Celtic traditions, the land itself was seen as a living goddess. Danu embodies this idea perfectly because she symbolizes fertile land, nourishing rain, flowing rivers, the cycle of life. And to ancient people, survival depended seriously only entirely on nature. A mother goddess like Danu represented the generosity of the earth, but its power as well. Without her gifts, life would cease. One of the fascinating things about Danu is how little mythology survives about her directly. Now, historians believe this may be because much of Celtic mythology was passed down orally. Christian scribes later recorded the myths and often removed or minimized pagan gods. Some stories were lost entirely to time in some cases. So while we know her name and her importance, much of her story has faded into legend. In a way, that mystery makes her even more powerful, because she represents the forgotten roots of mythology. Today, Danu has experienced a revival in modern Celtic spirituality in neo-pagan traditions. She is often honored as Great Earth Mother, a goddess of water and fertility, a symbol of divine feminine power. Many people see her as a reminder of humanity's connection to nature, a mother of not just gods, but of the living world itself. Long before heroes fought and gods ruled Ireland, before magic weapons and epic battles, there was a mother, a quiet force flowing through rivers, forests, and soil. And in the oldest whispers of Irish mythology, her name was Danu. Her presence reminds us every story, hero, or war begins in her womb. So let's talk about Eru, the beautiful and powerful concept in Irish mythology, because she isn't just a goddess, she is the land itself. Okay, she is Ireland. And in the oldest Irish myths, the land of Ireland is not just geography, it is alive. It has a spirit, a guardian, and a name. That spirit is Eru. Her name is the origin of the modern Irish word for Ireland. When people speak of Ireland poetically as Erin, they are speaking of Eru. She is not simply a goddess of the land, she is the land. As one of the sovereignty goddesses of Ireland, divine figures who represent the health, prosperity, and rightful rule to lead the land, she is often mentioned alongside her sisters, Bandba and Fola. These three sisters were powerful figures tied to Ireland's identity. Each asked that the island be named after them, but it was Eru's name that endured, which means every time we say Ireland, we are echoing a goddess, which I've said a lot. So, hello, ma'am. She appears most famously in the myth story of the Milesians, the ancestors of the Irish people. When the Milesians sailed to Ireland, they encountered the magical race known as Tuatha De Danann. Before the battle for Ireland began, the Milesians met the three sovereignty goddesses. Each goddess has the same thing. If you take this land, remember me. Eru asked that the island forever bear her name, and the Milesians agreed. Even though the Tuatha De Danann eventually retreated into the Otherworld, the promise remained. Ireland became Eru's land. Ancient Celtic belief held that the land was not owned, it was sacred. Kings did not rule over the land, they ruled with the blessing of the land itself. If a king ruled unjustly, the land would suffer. Crops would fail, storms would be more active, and animals would weaken. A good ruler was believed to be spiritually married to the sovereignty goddess. In Ireland's case, that divine bride was Eru. Now, even today, Eru echoes through Irish geography. Ireland's landscape often feels mythic because so many places are tied to the ancient stories. The sacred hills, mythic rivers, the ancient standing stones, fairy mounds. In folklore, the land itself remembers. Mountains, rivers, and valleys are seen as expressions of the divine feminine, the living body of Eru. Now, Eru appears in several early Irish mythological sources, such as the Book of the Taking of Ireland. These texts blend mythology, legend, and pseudo history to explain the origins of the Irish people. Anchorage. In them, Eru is both a goddess, a symbol of the island, a reminder that land and identity are inseparable. Now, let's talk about the poetic name Erin. Over centuries, poets and storytellers transformed Eru's name into Erin. You'll hear it in phrases like Erin go Bra, meaning Ireland forever. It's not just patriotism, it's devotion to the ancient spirit of the land itself. Now, unlike many myths where gods rule from distant heavens, Irish mythology is deeply tied to the earth. The land is sacred, the land remembers, and the land has a name Eru. She represents nature, sovereignty, identity, continuity through generations. Ireland is not just a place, it's a living story. The next time you see a misty green hill or hear the wind rolling across the sea cliffs, remember, in the oldest stories of Ireland, that land had a name, and her name was Eru. Before there were kings, and long before Ireland was called Ireland, and before saints walked its hills, there is Banva. She is one of the three divine sisters who personified the land of Ireland itself, ancient goddesses who represented the spirit, sovereignty, and sacred identity of the island. Her name once served as a poetic name for Ireland, used by the Irish immigrants, poets, and storytellers. And in the oldest myths, Ireland wasn't just land, it was alive, and Banva was one of its voices. Now, Banva and her sisters greeted invaders arriving in Ireland. Each sister had asked that the island be named after her. In the end, the Malaysians, those invaders and the mythic ancestors of the Irish people, chose Eru. But Banva's name never disappeared. It remained a poetic and mythological name for Ireland, especially in early literature. Now, she does appear in the medieval mythological text, the Book of the Taking of Ireland. And this is where they talk about how she greeted the Malaysians on the mountain, asked them to honor her by naming the land after her, and they made it non official. But that moment represents something deeper. In Celtic belief, true kingship required the blessing of the land itself, and Banva was that land. And she's often described as a sovereignty goddess. In Celtic tradition, sovereignty goddesses symbolize the land granting legitimacy to rulers. Think of it this way: a king did not own the land chose the king, and goddesses like Banva were the embodiment of that sacred bond. And they do say that she is sometimes married to Muck Cool, one of the last kings of Tuatha De Danann. Now, she is also associated with Mount Slieve Mish in County Kerry. In myth, this is where she arrives those Malaysians, remember? Now, mountains in Irish mythology often represent meeting points between the worlds, where humans encounter gods, essentially. So, Banva greeting newcomers from a mountain is symbolic. She stands at the threshold between myth and history. Now, though Eru became the main name for Ireland, Banva remained deeply woven into Irish poetry and nationalism. Writers sometimes use Banva as a symbolic name for the Irish nation. This poetic tradition continued for centuries, especially during periods of Irish resistance and cultural revival. Banva became a symbol of the ancient soul of Ireland. So, what does she represent? Well, she embodies themes central to Irish mythology: the sacredness of the land, the divine nature of sovereignty, the spiritual identity of a people, the idea that a nation has a soul. Unlike many mythological figures who fight battles or perform heroic feats, Banva's power is quieter, and she is the land itself. She is ancient, she is watchful, and she is eternal. Now, when the Irish speak of their homeland with reverence, when poets call it ancient, when songs speak of its spirit, they may unknowingly echo the voice of Banva, a goddess whose name still lingers in the wind over Ireland's hills. Now we're going to talk about the third sister of the sacred triad that actually tied to the identity and sovereignty of the island. Her name is Fola. Now, we talked about her sisters, Eru and Banva. However, we're going to talk about now Fola. So, when ancient poets and storytellers spoke of Fola, they were often speaking about Ireland herself, and they used her name in songs, poetry, and legends. She was the soul of the land, the ancient memory of the island, and a guardian spirit of Ireland's identity. She was part of the divine race known as the Tuatha De Danann. Remember, they were the supernatural beings, they were masters of magic, shapeshifters, keepers of ancient knowledge, rulers of Ireland before humans even arrived. And they were the ones who faced a legendary invasion from the Malaysians. And they represent the ancestors of the Irish people. The Malaysians, right? Now remember, the Malaysians arrived to conquer the island, and they met up with Banva, Fola, and Eru. All the sisters had a request. If the Malaysians took Ireland, they should name the island after her, right? Well, unfortunately, only one sister got the honor, and that was Eru, which we already know becomes the Irish word for island, right? However, the other names never disappeared. Poets continued to use Banva and Fola as beautiful alternative names for Ireland. Now, Fola was said to live in ancient sacred landscapes, often associated with mystical halls and spiritual places tied to the Tuatha De Danann. So, some traditions are going to connect her to enchanted hills, sacred groves, and hidden realms beneath the earth. Now, remember, when the Tuatha De Danann were later defeated, they didn't die. They retreated into the Otherworld, and they became the mysterious Fae, the fairy folk of the Irish legend. This means Fola may still symbolically dwell in the hidden, magical layer of Ireland's landscape. Now, even centuries later, Irish poets love using the name Fola to refer to Ireland in a mythic and romantic way. For example, in traditional poetry and songs, you might see phrases like, "The green fields of Fola, the sons of Fola." These phrases connect modern Ireland to its ancient mythological roots. Fola represents several deep themes in Celtic mythology: connection to the land, sacred sovereignty, mystery and hidden magic, ancient identity and heritage. Unlike warrior goddesses like the Bav, Fola is quieter and more symbolic. A reminder that the land itself was sacred and alive in Irish belief. We've talked about a lot of powerful figures in Irish mythology, Irish folklore, all of it. But now we're going to come to a very powerful, very mysterious, and surprisingly humorous figure known as the Dagda. Now, he is known as the good god, and that doesn't mean he's morally good. That just means he's good at everything. He is a father figure deity, and he is associated with strength, fertility, magic, abundance, and kingship. He is actually one of the central gods of the Tuatha De Danann, which were the supernatural people who ruled Ireland before humans. Now, remember, he is very powerful, but he's also depicted as earthy, humorous, and sometimes even clumsy. This shows us a fascinating blend of cosmic power and human-like personality. But who is the Dagda? Well, he's good, right? He's the good god. But good in this context means good at magic, good at war, good at fertility and abundance, and good at leadership and wisdom. In other words, he was seen as the ultimate master of many arts. Now, often he is described as a large, powerful, bearded man, wearing a short tunic that barely covers him, which is a humorous image in myth, carrying immense magical objects and associated with earthly abundance and the cycles of nature. Now, the Dagda represents life itself: growth, nourishment, protection, and authority. Now, he's often considered the chief of the Tuatha De Danann, though not always in the strict ruling sense. He's more like a patriarch or wise elder guiding other gods, right? And so they do even describe him as the father or ancestor of many deities, including Brigid, who was the goddess of poetry, healing, and smithcraft, and Angus, god of love and beauty. And because of this the Dagda often symbolizes fertility and generative power, both physically and spiritually. Now, he's a happy mixture of cosmic power and human personality, and he has four very powerful magical items that he carries, right? And they are some of the most powerful magical items in Irish mythology. These treasures represent life, death, nourishment, and music. So let's get into it. So the Club of Life and Death. His giant war club had two magical ends. One side could kill enemies instantly, the other side revived the dead. This dual power symbolized the balance of destruction and renewal in nature, right? So that basically just goes and works with everything else. He had the power to either help you or kill you. But then he could make sure you didn't leave hungry. So the Cauldron of Endless Plenty. He owned a magical cauldron that never ran empty. No one ever left it hungry. This sacred object is sometimes connected to the cauldron of the Dagda, representing prosperity, hospitality, abundance. And this is where many scholars believe this myth actually influenced legends of the Holy Grail later. Now, the harp that controlled the seasons. Now, one of his most famous objects was a magical harp that could control the seasons, command people through music, and produce three emotional states: joy, sorrow, and sleep. In one famous myth, the harp is stolen by the Fomorians, but the Dagda calls it back with a spell, and it flies through the air, killing enemies along the way. Reminds me a little bit of Thor's hammer, but that's just me. And then we see how myths also reflect ancient Celtic beliefs in that a king's power depends on harmony with the land itself. So one of the Dagda's most fascinating relationships is with the powerful war goddess the Morrigan. Before the great second battle of Mag Turid, the Dagda meets the Morrigan at the river Eunice. They unite symbolically, often interpreted as a sacred marriage between land and ruler, fertility, and sovereignty. This is where the Morrigan promises to use her magic to ensure victory for the Tuatha De Danann. And we've talked about how the Dagda is deeply connected to agriculture and such, right? Well, he represents growth, harvest, sexual vitality, the nurturing power of the earth. And some scholars actually see him as a Father Earth deity, so similar to figures in other mythologies like Zeus or Odin. But the Dagda is more earthy and humorous, so that actually reflects this Celtic love for storytelling and paradox. Now, unlike many stern gods in mythology, the Dagda is sometimes portrayed as comically human, which we've already heard about, but some stories will describe him as gluttonous, lustful, wearing ridiculously short clothes, and eating massive portions of food in contest. This humor has meaning, though. It reflects the abundance of nature. The Dagda is life in its messy, joyful fullness. The Dagda represents several powerful themes in Celtic spirituality: the sacredness of the land, fertility and nourishment, balance between life and death, the power of music, and the responsibility of leadership. He embodies the idea that true power nourishes rather than destroys. And if you think about it, he's they make it very realistic because he is gluttonous, he is lustful, he does act ridiculous and wears short clothes to be ridiculous. He's just a perfect mixture between cosmic power and human personalities. Okay, so we have a very mysterious and powerful figure associated with the ocean, magic, and the boundary between the human world and the other world. And his name is Manannán mac Lir. His name literally means son of Lear. okay, linking him to the ancient sea god Lear. He is described as the guardian of the seas, the keeper of the magical treasures, and a guide to the other world, a mystical realm where the gods and spirits dwell. So who was he? He was a member of the Tuatha De Danann, and he appears in many Irish legends, such as a sea god controlling waves and storms, a master magician and illusionist, keeper of the enchanted treasures, shaper of mists that hid the otherworld, a guide who helps heroes reach magical lands. He's strongly connected to the Isle of Man, whose name is believed to have come from him. One of his most famous powers is his control of fog and illusion. He could surround entire islands with magical mist so that humans could never find them. This fog concealed other world locations such as the Isle of Apples, Land of Eternal Youth, and other enchanted islands where time flows differently. To humans, these places were almost impossible to reach without his help. You had to know somebody to be there, essentially. And he traveled the seas in incredible ways. He had a magical horse named Anver. This horse could run across the surface of the ocean like land. Or he rode in a chariot that moved across waves. These images symbolized his complete mastery over the sea. And he possessed several powerful magical items. He had a legendary sword that forced anyone struck by it to tell the truth. He had a cloak that could make him invisible or disguise his identity, and a magical bag containing sacred treasures of the gods. Inside were powerful items that only could be used at certain times or seasons. And he often appears helping famous Irish hero legends. All right. For example, Cuchulainn, he helped protect him with his magical assistance. And Lugh, he fostered and guided him, and he was the great warrior of the Tuatha De Danann. And he appeared to Bronn and revealed the path to the otherworld in the tale of the voyage of Bronn. So in all of these stories, he acts like a wise supernatural guide. Okay? Now, in several myths, he rules enchanted islands such as the Land of Promise, Isle of Apples, and the Plain of Delight. And these were paradises where no one aged, no one suffered illness, food and music never ended. And he is deeply tied to the Isle of Man. Legends say he protects it by covering it in magical mist, making it invisible to enemies. And he has even been said to demand rent from the island's inhabitants, paid in bundles of rushes each year. He represents several powerful themes in the Celtic mythology. Okay, the mystery of the sea, the thin veil between worlds, ancient magical knowledge, and guidance through spiritual journeys. The sea itself symbolized the unknown and the gateway to other realms, which made him a guardian of hidden wisdom.
But they're very important to Monica, and I want you to apologize to her right now.
I'm sorry. Mom, I'm so sorry.
Okay, that's better. Now I want you to apologize to each other and mean it.
Sorry.
Sorry? By the way, that fight was totally arousing. Well done.
Now let's get into some fascinating legends that involve him, okay? And these tales will show his role as a sea god, magician, trickster, and guardian of the otherworld. Alright, the invisible island of Man. Okay? One of the most famous legends says that he has protected the Isle of Man from invaders. Whenever enemies approach, he wraps the entire island in a magical mist so thick that ships sail past it without ever seeing land. Some stories say that he could even make the island appear as if it were floating far away, confusing invaders. Because of this power, he became the spirit of the island, and locals believed he demanded a yearly tribute of rushes, plants basically. Even today, the Isle of Man has a folklore tradition where rushes are connected to the old legends of him. Now, remember we talked about that horse that could run across the sea? Well, this magical horse could run across the ocean, move faster than the wind, and travel between the worlds. So when he rode across the waves, the sea itself seemed to bend to his will. Some stories say sailors who glimpsed him believed they had seen a ghostly rider galloping across the water under moonlight. This image became a very powerful symbol of the sea as a supernatural realm. Now, remember we talked about Bronn. Well, in the legendary tale of the Voyage of Bronn, a hero named Bronn sails west into the unknown. While traveling across the ocean, Bronn suddenly sees something impossible. A man riding across the sea in a chariot drawn by horses. This is our guy, okay? So this sea god tells Bronn that the ocean Bronn sees as water is actually a beautiful plain full of flowers and life, but humans can only see it as water. So Bronn is then guided toward the Otherworld islands where time stands still and paradise exists. It is one of the earliest Irish stories about voyages into supernatural realms. Now, remember one of those magical objects he had, the crane bag? Well, the bag was made from the skin of a cursed woman transformed into a crane. Inside were powerful sacred treasures belonging to the Tuatha De Danann, including magical weapons, sacred objects, and items tied to the power of the gods. But the bag had a strange rule. At low tide, it would appear empty. At high tide, it was full of treasures. This symbolized the rhythms of the sea and hidden magic. Later, the bag was passed to the hero Lo. Now, the magical gifts to the hero Cormac. Now, one of his most famous appearances involves the High King, Cormac Mac Airt. So, our good friend here appeared disguised as a mysterious warrior and offered Cormac several magical gifts. These included a silver branch with golden apples. When shaken, it played enchanting music that could heal sorrow. The Cup of Truth. The magical cup would shatter if someone told a lie, but repair itself when truth was spoken. Through these objects, it was a test on whether Cormac was wise enough to rule Ireland. Well, guess what? Cormac passed the test and became one of Ireland's most respected legendary kings. Now, we get a bonus legend as well. His self-sailing boat. It was a magical ship, and it was called the Wave Sweeper. And this ship had extraordinary powers. It needed no sails. It always knew where to go, and it could travel between the human world and the other world. Some legends say the ship could even change size depending on who boarded it, which is interesting to me because given everything that he could do, bending the size of a ship isn't all that surprising. Now, he was truly a complex individual. He controlled time in the other world. Because, see, he wasn't just a sea god. He was a keeper of time. And remember that he was very involved. And we remember that in Tirnog, time flowed differently. So a person might spend a few days in the other world, but when they return, hundreds of years have passed in Ireland. And many legends suggest that he controlled the pathways between these worlds, which really means that he could decide who experienced this strange time shift. So if he didn't like you, you might be in a mess. Just a fact. And he was a master of shape-shifting. So he could change his appearance at will. So he could be an old man, a mysterious warrior, a supernatural sailor, a noble king. So this ability made him a trickster figure in many stories. Now, some early Irish poets described the ocean as his cloak. The waves themselves were believed to be the folds of his magical robe, and when storms rose, people believed that he was riding across the sea, shaking his cloak, stirring the waters. And this poetic imagery appears in early Irish literature describing the sea as a living divine force. Now, he was the foster father of the gods. Fostering fosterage was extremely important in Irish mythology. He acted as a foster father and teacher to several divine figures, right? And he raised heroes by teaching them magic, warfare, wisdom, and leadership. Now, remember that cauldron he had, or that we had, that Dagda had? Okay, well, this guy, he actually had one strange power in his magical pigs. Okay. These pigs had an incredible property. They could be killed and eaten, but the next day they returned to life again. This means that there was an endless feast available, and this symbolized the Otherworld's eternal abundance. Now, remember, he could hide islands, but his magic wasn't just for hiding islands. He could cloak entire armies in mists. This power was used to protect the supernatural force, the race, remember, known as Tuatha De Danann. Right? Now, the idea of magical mist appears in many Celtic legends, and he would use this fog and illusion to confuse enemies and protect the gods. Now, we have heard of the legend of the Flying Dutchman, right? Well, guess what? He may have inspired it. Some historians think that sightings of ghost ships or mysterious figures at sea in Celtic religions might have been the inspirations, and it was him. So, sailors sometimes report seeing ships appearing from the fog, riders moving across waves, and boats sailing with no sails. These supernatural sightings resemble later maritime legends like the Flying Dutchman. In Celtic regions, though, these visions were often attributed to him traveling between the worlds, not the Flying Dutchman. Now, across the grey waters of the Irish Sea, sailors once whispered that the mist itself was alive, and that somewhere beyond it rode the ancient guardian of the ocean, guiding heroes, hiding enchanted islands, and keeping the secrets of the other world. Alright, now remember we talked about Lugh, who had warrior, poet, blacksmith, musician, craftsman, strategist, king, all of those things related to him, right? And he was actually known as Lugh of the Long Arm, deadly with a spear. And he was basically the master of all skills, okay? He led the Tuatha De Danann to victory against the monstrous beings known as the Fomorians. And his weapon? A blazing spear that never missed. There's actually a harvest festival named for him, and it marks harvest seasons, a celebration of abundance and survival. He embodies brilliance, talent, and radiant leadership. He represents light overcoming darkness. And does that sound familiar? These myths shaped Ireland's spiritual backbone long before Christianity ever arrived. Now we come upon a quiet but powerful legend. Where Cuchulainn was fire, Finn was strategy. A poet spent years trying to catch the salmon of knowledge, a fish that had eaten hazelnuts from the sacred well of wisdom. A boy, his young apprentice, accidentally tasted the salmon of knowledge. He burned his thumb cooking it, put it in his mouth, and boom! Wisdom awakened. How? His young apprentice accidentally gained all the wisdom in the world. That apprentice? Finn McCool. From then on, whenever he needed insight, he would chew his thumb. He later became the leader of the Fianna, an elite band of warriors who protected Ireland. Wisdom in Irish myth is not inherited. It is earned, or stumbled into. Iconic, honestly, though. Now, his stories are full of giant battles, shapeshifters, enchanted love stories, and epic quests. Some legends even say he built the Giant's Causeway to fight a Scottish giant. Subtle? Absolutely not. Legendary? 100%. Alright, let's go ahead and talk power. Queen Maeve wasn't a side character. She launched an entire war simply because she refused to be outmatched in wealth by her husband. She demanded equality, dominance, and legend status. She was strategic, commanding, and unapologetic. And in Celtic mythology, women led armies, women fought, women ruled. Maeve is ambition personified. She is one of the most famous figures in Irish mythology. She ruled in the first millennium mythic age. She was renowned for her power, cunning, and fierce intelligence, often described as both beautiful and formidable on the battlefield. She is a symbol of female sovereignty, a queen whose authority and ambition rivaled any king. Unlike typical rulers, she didn't need a man to validate her rule. In some stories, she was equal or even superior to her male counterparts. So, we talked about her ambition and strategies, right? She was cunning and politically savvy. She orchestrated the famous cattle raid to match her wealth with her husband. She was a fierce warrior. She led armies into battle, rode at the front lines, and was unafraid of confrontation. Seductive and charismatic. She used charm and seduction as a tool of power, negotiating alliances and manipulating rivals. She is independent and proud. She is often seen as a proto-feminist figure. She pursued her desires boldly, whether for land, cattle, or love. So, one of her most famous feats was leading an army to steal the brown bull of Cooley to ensure her wealth matched her husband's. This epic battle is the heart of the Ulster cycle featuring legendary heroes like Cuchulainn. She married multiple kings to strengthen her political power. Each marriage was a strategic move, reinforcing her influence across Ireland, and that was 7 husbands. Okay. Her son was said to inherit her cunning and ambition. Some stories hint at her desire to shape destiny through her lineage. Her husband often acted as a foil to her boldness, highlighting her drive for dominance and equality in wealth and status. Now, she is sometimes associated with the land itself. Her power echoes the sovereignty goddess motif in Celtic mythology, linking kingship with the fertility of the land. Now, she is remembered as a sovereignty goddess archetype, a queen whose power comes from land and charisma, a female icon of mythic proportions. Her stories celebrate female agency and strategic intelligence. A very complex character, both admired and feared, representing ambition, lust, and leadership. In modern times, she inspires novels, films, and art portraying strong female warriors. And can that surprise anybody? Really? The pattern of Celtic heroes and what makes them different from, say, what, Greek heroes, is that they don't always win. They burn bright, they live intensely, they accept prophecy, and they embrace fate. There is no immortality reward, there's legacy. And legacy to the Celts was eternal. And let's talk about those Celtic goddesses. They are not static. They are fierce and protective. They are fluid and mysterious, wise beyond human understanding, and they are agents of fate, morality, and cosmic balance. Heroes may fight, but goddesses shape the very laws of existence. They are the ultimate power, not conquered, only honored. We are wild. We are layered. We are capable of both tenderness and battle. And sometimes the most powerful magic is simply surviving. We've learned that power comes in many forms. Sometimes it's fiery and chaotic. Sometimes it's nurturing and subtle. Sometimes terrifying and all encompassing. The goddesses remind us respect, reverence, and courage are timeless. In Ireland's myths, women held the earth, the seasons, the fate of warriors, and the hearts of mortals. That's legacy. That's magic, and that's divine feminine. And then we have to ask ourselves, with the Celtic goddesses and those Celtic heroes, why does Irish folklore feel different? Well, if you haven't noticed, Irish folklore isn't neatly tied up. It lingers, it warns, it aches. It isn't morally simple. Gods fall in love, heroes fail. Heroes weren't polished. They were flawed and fierce, emotional, and bound by honor. And then fate wins. It's not about perfection. It honors bravery in the face of inevitability. It honors hospitality and loyalty, respect for the unseen, and understanding that the world is layered. Celtic myth doesn't promise safety, it promises meaning. And maybe that's why these stories survived invasions, colonization, famine, and time itself. Because somewhere deep in Ireland's soil, the old heroes still stand. The goddesses still watch over, and Ireland claims its ancient knowledge and is proud of it. Buttercups, maybe the reason we find Irish folklore so captivating is that because it isn't simply magical. It's a reminder that time is slippery, life is fragile, and courage matters. Thank you for stepping through the Otherworld gates with me this week. May your week be bold like Cuchulainn, radiant like Lugh, untouchable like the Morrigan, and may your story be worthy of the firelight, and honor the goddesses who walk unseen beside you. And maybe, just maybe, if you ever find yourself walking past an old ring fort in the Irish countryside, you whisper a polite hello, just in case. Until next time, stay magical, keep your stories sacred, and your spirit wild. Buttercups, I thank you for listening and for being a part of this journey with me. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you have a great week ahead. Now, should you have any questions, comments, or, maybe future topics, you can email me at harktisthetebelle@gmail.com. You can locate me on Facebook, Spotify, and YouTube. And please remember that this is a one-woman show. So, as we go on this journey together, you are growing as I grow. But until next time, Buttercups.